Hi, and welcome back to this Monday edition of Focal Point on AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. You are listening to high definition radio right here on Focal Point AFR Talk. More content per cubic inch of air than any other place on your radio dial. And again, talking about the fact that there is no way in the world that homosexual behavior ever ought to be legitimized by any rational thinking, sane society. Now, we may not be able to stop people from engaging in this kind of behavior. You can't stop people from poking their eye out with a scissors if they're determined to do it. But that doesn't mean we think it's a good idea, that we think that's behavior that ought to be imitated, that we ought to encourage that kind of behavior, that we ought to promote that kind of behavior, and that we ought to provide special protections for that kind of behavior in law. And we're looking at what's happening in New York City, this outbreak of meningitis, which can damage your brain and can kill you. And this particular outbreak is confined to homosexuals having anonymous sex with each other. This is not a lifestyle that we ought to promote, that we ought to endorse, that we ought to sanction, and that we ought to legitimize with the term marriage. Just should not do it. So there's just this politically correct, brainless kind of irrationality that's driving this push toward same-sex marriage. But we need a public policy that is thoughtful and is reasonable and is rational and is objective. We shouldn't be making public policy based on irrationality and based on emotion. Now, a lot of these polls. I want to go to the phones here. We'll do that here in just a second. I just want to make one more comment before we go to the phones. A lot of these polls about same-sex marriage, the way that a poll question is put determines the result of the poll virtually without exception. Now, I frankly think that when most people hear a poll question today on same-sex marriage, the way they interpret the question is very simple. Do you think people should be nice to gay people? That's the way they interpret the question. Do you think people should be nice to them or should they be mean to them? That's the way they interpret the question. Now, the question doesn't have anything to do with it. It's whether we ought to sanctify those relationships with the term marriage. That's the question. But people say, no, I want to be nice to homosexuals, so I'll say I'm for same-sex marriage. Now, if you were to ask them, for instance, a more objective question about same-sex marriage. For instance, if you were to ask them, do you think that we should promote behavior that's as dangerous to human health as intravenous drug abuse? Yes or no? What are people going to say? They're going to say, no, that's a stupid idea. We shouldn't be promoting behavior that's as dangerous to human health as intravenous drug use. So I don't know what the response to that would be. 70-30, 80-10, 80-20, 90-10, who knows? I mean, it ought to be 100%. Who'd be for any kind of promoting any kind of behavior that's as dangerous to human health as injection drug abuse? So if you ask the question objectively, would you be in favor of domestic relationships that had proven to be harmful to children? Yes or no? No, I'm not for that. I don't want children to be harmed. But this is exactly what we know happens in same-sex households. We have social research to verify it. Mark Regner's University of Texas at Austin did the most extensive research into people that had grown up in same-sex households. And he interviewed them, and they talked about their experience growing up in same-sex households. And they admitted that they fared worse on 77 out of 80 possible outcomes compared to children raised in intact homes with their biological parents married to each other. So we know there is simply no question that if you put kids into a same-sex household, the chances are very good they are going to experience suboptimal outcomes. So you put the marriage question, do you think we ought to put kids in domestic arrangements which are optimal for their well-being? Everybody would say, 100% would say, yeah. Well, that's an argument against same-sex marriage right there, and people just aren't smart enough or aware enough to realize it. Let's go to the phones. Let's go to Perry, Lake Charles, Louisiana. Perry, you're on Focal Point. What's on your mind?
Hey, Brian. I sure appreciate your show. I hadn't talked to you in a while. I can't get over the arrogance of the government now and the liberals in general that they can change God's laws and natural laws to anything they want. Since obviously you and I know that gay marriage is an impossibility. It's not defined by God as a marriage when it's that way. But they're going to make it legal anyway and force us to accept it. And that's the point that's atrocious to me. The stories that you hear about the bakers that make wedding cakes that turn down lesbian couples for their wedding or whatever they want to call it, civil unions, and the photographer that's still in litigation in, I think, Arizona or New Mexico,
yes,
not wanting to take the pictures of the lesbian community. They want us to respect and tolerate their lifestyle. Why don't they respect and tolerate our right to our faith and to what we believe? And they don't. Our government comes down on us with both feet, and I consider that abuse.
Yeah.
Tyranny. It's I'm telling you, it's tyranny now, and we better start speaking out against it, or it's going to keep getting worse. We just don't think it's strong enough to stand and call it what it is. We don't call the president a liar when he's a liar and a traitor when he's a traitor, and it's paying off now in dividends that we don't want to see.
Well, I agree with you, Perry, and you know what will happen is if the Supreme Court imposes same-sex marriage on all 50 states, which is one of the possible outcomes here, it's certainly a possible outcome, same-sex marriage gets imposed on all 50 states, then that is going to threaten the religious liberty of every single American, every single student, every single business owner who believes that in man-woman marriage, who believes in marriage as God designed it and as God defined it. That individual is now going to be on the wrong side of the law. Their point of view is now going to be illegal in America, and it's just a matter of time before their businesses start getting shut down, before they start getting kicked out of college programs, before their businesses start getting closed down for being homophobic discriminators. So you're exactly right, Perry. This is, again, where people are simply blind. They just don't understand that every advance of the homosexual agenda comes at the expense of religious liberty every single time. And again, don't believe this business about diversity. You know, Perry brought up the case of this photographer in New Mexico. She was fined $6,700 because she politely refused to photograph a lesbian commitment ceremony, even though lesbian relationships have no legal status of any kind in New Mexico whatsoever. And yet she was fined $6,700. She appealed it to court. There was the New Mexico Human Rights Commission found against her. She appealed it, actually got into the court system, and the court found against her, upheld this fine of $6,700. Now it's going to the New Mexico State Supreme Court. But once again, this idea of diversity is a total myth. Because if they really believed in diversity, then what would the lesbians say when they went to her shop to ask her to do their commitment ceremony? And she said, no, I'm a born-again Christian. I believe marriage is one man, one woman. I'm not going to be able to do it. Here's the name of a photographer who probably can help you. If they really believed in diversity, they would say, hey, that's cool, man. That's a way cool deal. We believe in diversity. I understand you believe in marriage as one man, one woman. That is cool. I am down with that. We believe in all the colors of the rainbow, and I think that's just fantastic that you've got your own view on this subject, because that's what makes the world go around, is people having different points of view and having the freedom to express them. If they believed in diversity, that's what they would say. They didn't. They hauled her into court. They don't believe in diversity whatsoever. And so if same-sex marriage is imposed on the whole United States, then our freedom, our religious freedom, our freedom of conscience, our freedom of speech, our freedom of the press, our freedom of association is gone. It is history. It is out of here. It's in the archives. Let's go to Bob, Crest Hill, Illinois. Bob, welcome to Focal Point. What's on your mind?
I heard that it is a movement in Canada where the Catholic Church will be required to marry people of the same sex, that the government is going to not only legalize, or if they have not already legalized same-sex marriages, but they're going to make the Catholic Church perform marriage ceremonies for same-sex people. Is that true?
Now that I have not, that specific angle I've not heard, Bob, but I will tell you this, that...
Well, no, wait a minute. I'm not really interested in hearing your impression of it, because I've listened to you for a half hour now, and I'm glad you think you're so much more intelligent than the rest of us, and you can see what others, such as myself, cannot see, because we're not as bright as you are, and when we answer surveys and questions, we think different things because we're sort of stupid. So I'm not interested in your interpretation. I'm just interested in whether you know whether that law exists.
What I can tell you, Bob, is that courts in Canada have ruled that taking a biblical view of human sexuality is a hate crime. So if you believe, Bob, you believe what the Bible teaches about marriage as a union of one man and one woman, that has now become a hate crime in the country of Canada. And if you express that view, that has now become hate speech. You can go to prison for that in Canada. How does that sound to you?
Stand up in Canada and say, I don't think that same-sex marriages ought to be legal, you can go to jail for that?
That is correct. Do you think that's right, Bob, that you ought to be sent?
I don't think that's correct. Personally,
it is correct.
I don't have any knowledge of it, just like you said you don't have any knowledge of whether or not the Catholic Church is going to be required to marry people.
Well, Bob, I do have knowledge of this. In fact, I got a story right here in my stack somewhere that talks about the fact that support for a biblical view of sexuality is now officially a hate crime in Canada, and you can go to prison for it. I know that for a fact. Do you think that's a good idea, Bob?
No, I do not think that is a good idea.
Okay, well, we're on the same page then. So, all right. So I'm curious, Bob. You seem to take offense at my view of this issue of sexuality. What's your problem with my view?
Generalities.
What's that?
I take offense of people who characterize generalities by saying something like, yes, here's a survey that says 60% of the people. You know what? If we only change that question, of course, if you change the question to say, do you want to do anything to hurt children? But you make the assumption that hurting children comes out of a situation that may or may not be more neutral than you believe it to be.
No, Bob, I'm not making Bob, I'm not making any kind of assumption at all. Mark Regnerus, University of Texas, did the most extensive research into this and discovered that children raised in same-sex households do worse on 77 out of 80 outcomes. That means that same-sex environments are risky for children. If we care about children, we ought to try to keep them out of those suboptimal environments. That's just a fact. Focal Point AFR Talk.